What if the Bible isn't just a book, but the first form of encryption most humans ever touched? Hear me out. Empires collapse, languages die, libraries burn, people rewrite history for sport. And yet this text survives wars, censorship, hand-copied manuscripts, translation after translation, and non-stop arguments about what it really means. And it's still recognizable, still recited, still debated, still shaping lives. Now take your idea one step further. If God created everything, then God would also be capable of creating a message that doesn't depend on a single perfect copy. A message that can survive human meddling, human bias, and yes, human corruption. Because the core meaning keeps resurfacing, even when the surface gets scratched. Today we're going to treat that as a thought experiment, not to prove faith with math, and definitely not Shaozi conspiracy stuff. We're going to explore something much more interesting. In what sense can the Bible function like an anti-tamper text, layered with redundancy, structure, and keys that make it hard to erase the essence without leaving fingerprints? And I'm telling you up front, the more you understand how this text was written, copied, preserved, and translated, the stranger it gets that it's still here, still alive. First, a basic thing most people miss. The Bible didn't drop into history as one book. It started as a library. A collection of writings from different centuries, different authors, different communities, different genres, law, poetry, narrative, prophecy, letters, circulating and being preserved long before they were bound into what we now call the Bible. And from the beginning, it's also multilingual. The Hebrew Bible was written primarily in Biblical Hebrew, with portions in Aramaic. The New Testament was written in Koine Greek, the everyday Greek of the era. That alone creates a code effect. Because translation isn't neutral. Every translation is a series of decisions, and every decision reveals something while hiding something else. But the encryption vibe really kicks in when you zoom into Biblical Hebrew itself. For a long stretch of history, Hebrew was written mainly with consonants. The vowels weren't marked the way modern readers expect, so reading it correctly relied heavily on oral tradition, context, training. It's like you're handed the skeleton of the word, and you need to know the living pronunciation to bring it fully to life. And when a language works like that, something fascinating happens. The same consonantal base can sometimes support more than one possible reading depending on tradition and context. Not in a anything-goes way. Hebrew has patterns, roots, rules, but it has an elasticity that makes the text feel like it contains doors inside doors. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. Because the tradition doesn't pretend that reading and writing are always identical. In the Hebrew textual tradition, you find a system that essentially tracks two layers, what's written in the consonants and what's traditionally read aloud. This is known as ketiv and kere. Sometimes the manuscript preserves one form, while the reading tradition preserves another. So the text carries both, the preserved written form and the preserved spoken interpretation. If you're thinking like a modern cryptographer, that's wild. It's like a document that keeps the raw data and the authorized decoding side by side. Instead of smoothing out the differences, it records them. Is it an error? Sometimes it's a linguistic update. Sometimes it's a preserved older spelling. Sometimes it's tradition protecting reverence in how something is spoken. The point is, the system flags the divergence instead of hiding it. That's the opposite of secret tampering. It's transparent guardianship. Now add the next layer, the Masoretes. In the medieval period, Jewish scribes and scholars developed an incredibly detailed system to preserve the text. They didn't just copy words. They checked, they annotated. They created marginal notes, marks, and consistency checks designed to prevent small copying mistakes from silently mutating into permanent changes. In practice, it acts like a cultural verification system. Not digital, not mathematical in the modern sense, but functionally similar to what we'd call integrity checks. If someone tried to alter the text quietly, they'd be fighting a tradition built to notice. And this connects directly to your theme about human corruption. Because even if people try to steer narratives, a distributed text is hard to hijack without leaving evidence. Once a text spreads, once copies exist across regions, once communities memorize and recite, editing the past becomes a messy job. The more it replicates, the harder it is to rewrite without getting caught. Now let's widen the lens, because not everyone lived in a world where Hebrew was understood. There were Jewish communities spread across the Mediterranean who spoke Greek and didn't have easy access to Hebrew literacy. And this is where Alexandria enters the story, one of the most iconic knowledge centers of the ancient world. In that Hellenistic Jewish environment, a major Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures emerged, the Septuagint. There's even an ancient origin story about translators and a kind of miraculous agreement across their work. Scholars treat that legend as, at least partly, a legendary origin tale. But the historical impact is real. This translation became a bridge. It let the text travel across language, culture, and geography. And if we're still playing with the encryption metaphor, here's what that does. It creates redundancy. Now you don't have one textual stream, you have multiple streams in multiple languages. If someone tries to force a meaning in one language, comparison with another can expose the drift. If a nuance is softened here, it might be sharper there. Translation can distort, but it can also preserve, because now the message exists in more than one form, and the tension itself becomes a kind of protection. The essence, if it's real, has to survive not just copying, but interpretation. Now we hit a moment that makes this whole topic feel less like metaphor and more like history. There is actual cipher-like encoding inside the biblical world. In the book of Jeremiah, a strange name appears, Sheshach. For a long time it reads like a mysterious place, but there's a known ancient letter substitution method called Atbash, where the first letter swaps with the last, the second with the second to last, and so on. Apply it, and Sheshach decodes to Babylon. In other words, in a politically dangerous environment, a writer may have used a simple cipher to mask a target. That's not sci-fi. That's the mindset of coded language showing up in the world of the text itself. So the question becomes, was that a one-off trick, or just a visible example of a deeper reality, where language, symbolism, and oral tradition already functioned like layers? Now this is where people get tempted to go full clickbait, so I'm going to handle it carefully. In Jewish interpretive traditions, especially mystical streams, the Hebrew letters aren't just letters. They also carry numeric values. They're symbols. That opens the door to methods like gematria, where words are compared through numerical equivalence, and other letter-based techniques that rearrange or transform words to suggest additional layers of meaning. That is not cryptography in the modern, secure communication sense. It's not hiding a password. It's closer to a sacred style of reading, treating the text as densely structured, where form can carry significance alongside content. To an outsider, it looks like code. To an insider, it looks like a way of honoring the depth of the text. And here's a detail that fits your theme perfectly. The Bible isn't just message, it's architecture. You can find poems and passages engineered with patterns. There are Hebrew acrostics, texts where lines or stanzas follow the alphabet in sequence, from Aleph to Tav. The most famous is Psalm 119, structured in blocks where each section aligns with a specific Hebrew letter. That does two things. It helps memorization, and it anchors the message into a form. It's like building the words into a frame, and if someone tried to heavily alter that kind of passage, the structure would break. The form would rat out the edit. It's not proof of divine origin, but it is a real kind of robustness, an aesthetic tamper seal. Now we need to get real about something else. When people say they tried to corrupt the Bible, they often imagine a simple story, one perfect original, then bad people trying to twist it. The real history is more complicated, and honestly more interesting. There are textual variants. There were periods where multiple textual traditions coexisted. Different communities preserved slightly different streams. And paradoxically, that's part of what makes the preservation story compelling. Because instead of depending on one fragile chain, you have multiple chains. It's a network, and networks have noise, but they also have resilience. This is where the Dead Sea Scrolls changed the vibe. When these ancient manuscripts were discovered, they delivered two messages at once. In many places, they showed remarkable stability across centuries, and in other places, they revealed diversity, evidence that textual forms were still stabilizing and that communities sometimes had variants side by side. If you think in terms of a distributed system, that's exactly what you'd expect. Not a single file, but a living network. And living networks don't preserve by being perfect. They preserve by being widespread and cross-checkable. Now let's open another door, because this is where the mystery gets cinematic. There were other texts orbiting this world, writings that were influential in certain communities, debated, copied, sometimes included, sometimes excluded. The Book of Enoch is the clearest example. It's not part of the canon for most modern Christian traditions, but it mattered in ancient contexts, and it was preserved fully in the Ethiopian tradition, while fragments in older languages show up among the Dead Sea Scrolls. That means the biblical world was bigger than the Bible most people hold today. There was a constellation of writings. Some were canonized, some weren't. Some were preserved in one culture and lost in another. Some survived through translation while the originals faded. If you're exploring the encryption idea, it feels like a vault with compartments, where parts of the library are locked by history, and keys are scattered across languages and continents. Now, I want to pause here to avoid the biggest trap on the internet. The moment you say Bible in code, people jump to those sensational claims about hidden messages predicting world events through letter skips. What's often marketed as the Bible code. It goes viral because the human brain loves patterns, but we need intellectual honesty. In any text large enough, you can find uncanny patterns by chance, especially if you search long enough and allow flexible rules. Finding something doesn't prove it was planted intentionally. So if you want this topic to stay powerful and grounded, there's a better approach. You don't need a secret matrix predicting the future to call the Bible coded. The Bible is naturally layered because of how it was written, transmitted, recited, translated, and interpreted. Sometimes the key is linguistic, consonantal writing, Semitic roots, wordplay that doesn't survive translation. Sometimes the key is historical, knowing what Babylon meant in that moment, what exile meant, what empire meant. Sometimes the key is literary, parallelism, chiasm, repetition patterns that organize meaning. Sometimes the key is communal, oral tradition preserving pronunciation, cadence, and reading. So here's the question in its most haunting form. If you believe God is the source, maybe the protection isn't a secret message hidden in one line. Maybe the protection is that the message was built to survive as an ecosystem, not dependent on one manuscript, one language, one institution, one empire. A message that, when someone tries to control it, slips out another door. Maybe that's the strongest kind of encryption. Not the kind nobody can break, but the kind nobody can erase. Because even when people scratch the surface, the layers still connect. And I'll end with a final thought that hits hard whether you're religious or not. When people say, the word endures, it sounds poetic. But historically, what happened was brutal and real. People risked their lives to copy. Communities memorized and recited as a form of survival. Translators risked reputation. Empires tried to control. Movements tried to standardize. And inside that chaos, the text didn't just survive, it multiplied. Even if you don't call it a miracle, it's hard not to call it a phenomenon. So here's the question I'm leaving you with. Is this the signature of a divine kind of encryption, designed to resist the human impulse to distort? Or is it proof that once an idea becomes sacred to millions, it evolves into the most durable form possible? Because you can't kill a story once it becomes language, song, memory, identity. And if this topic pulled you in, subscribe, because some questions aren't meant to end debates. They're meant to ignite them. Also, drop your take in the comments and send me topic ideas you want to see next. I read everything, and I'm posting one video a day.